Hello everyone. Today we're going to step into a story that might feel familiar to some, frightening to others, and unforgettable to me. Picture this. The room is quiet, but not peaceful. The clock ticks, loud enough to echo through walls that once felt like home. My hands are cold. My chest feels heavy, and even though I'm surrounded by everything I thought I wanted, I can't shake the feeling that I am trapped. This is not the life I dreamed of. This is the life I built for him. And in return, he built me a prison. I wasn't born into darkness. I came from a place of warmth, of possibility. I believed in people, in love, in sacrifice. When I first met him, I thought I was looking at someone who just needed a chance, someone whose fire was dimmed by hardship but could burn bright again if given the right spark. That spark, I thought, could be me. The truth? It was me. I gave him my time, my trust, my resources, and my faith. I built him a future with my own two hands. And yet, somewhere in the middle of all that building, the walls rose up around me. At first, it didn't feel like a prison. It felt like devotion, like partnership. He would smile and tell me that we were unstoppable, that we were better together. And I believed it. Who wouldn't want to believe that the person they loved was destined to grow alongside them? I worked harder than ever. I gave up nights of sleep. I turned down opportunities for myself, and I funneled every ounce of energy into his dream, because I thought his dream was ours. But here's the truth I didn't see back then. Sometimes, when you're so focused on lifting someone else up, you don't notice how far you've sunk. Every brick I laid for his success became a wall between me and the freedom I once had. Every sacrifice I made for us was really just another chain around my wrists. He didn't need to lock me in with iron bars. He used my own love, my own hope, my own blind faith. The hardest part to admit is that I let it happen. I handed him the tools. I told myself it was noble, that it was love. But love without respect is nothing but control wearing a mask. And by the time I realized what had happened, I wasn't just supporting him, I was trapped inside the very structure I had built. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you really like what I'm doing here. And while you're here, let me ask. Where are you watching this from? And when? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to know who's sharing this moment with me. Because the story I'm about to tell isn't just mine. It's for anyone who's ever poured themselves into someone else and found themselves empty. It's for the dreamers, the builders, the ones who believed love meant giving everything until there was nothing left. I need you to know, you are not alone. This is my beginning, the promise I made, the love I gave, the future I thought I was creating. And it is also the warning. Be careful what you build, because sometimes what you think is a home can quietly become your cage. I still remember the exact moment our paths crossed, as if the air itself paused to make room for what was about to happen. I was standing at the edge of a crowded hall, tired from another long day of pushing forward with my own small dreams, when I noticed him. He didn't stand out at first glance, not the kind of person everyone turned their heads for. But there was something in his eyes that caught me. A hunger, a quiet desperation, the kind of look that whispered, I could be more, if only someone believed in me. And I believed. He spoke to me with a charm that felt both raw and unpolished, the kind of honesty you don't usually hear. His words were clumsy at times, but his smile had a way of softening them. He told me about his ideas, his plans, how he wanted to build a future, but didn't quite know how to start. As I listened, I saw not just the man standing in front of me, but the man he could become. I saw potential where others might only see failure. Looking back, I realized that's when the foundation of my cage was first laid. Not with chains or walls, but with hope. Hope is powerful, and when you place it in the wrong hands, it can be dangerous. But back then, I didn't see danger. I saw a project, a story, a chance to create something greater than myself. I saw him. We started talking often, sometimes deep into the night. He would tell me about the things he wanted: success, stability, recognition. He wanted to make his mark, to escape the shadows of mediocrity he had lived in. And each time he spoke, I found myself offering more than just words of encouragement. I gave him plans, ideas, strategies. My brain raced with possibilities, and he soaked it all in, grateful and amazed that someone like me would see something valuable in him. There's a dangerous line between love and rescue. I didn't just care for him. I wanted to save him. I thought if I could give him my strength, my vision, then together we could conquer anything. And for a while, it felt beautiful. He admired me for my determination, and I admired him for his willingness to dream. We became inseparable, building the beginning blocks of what I thought was our shared future. But even in those early days, there were signs I ignored. The way he would sometimes dismiss my own accomplishments as less important because they weren't part of his vision. The subtle way he always steered our conversations back to his needs, his goals. At the time, I thought it was harmless, just his passion shining through. I didn't notice that I was already shrinking to make space for him to grow. When I introduced him to my friends, he charmed them easily, though some of them pulled me aside later and asked if I was sure. "He seems intense," they said. I laughed it off. Of course he was intense. People with dreams should be intense. I told myself they just didn't understand him the way I did. I told myself that if I could see his worth, then eventually everyone else would too. What I didn't realize was that my belief in him was more than just support. It was surrender. I was already giving up small pieces of myself, trading them for a future I thought we'd share. And piece by piece, without even noticing, I was beginning to disappear. Meeting him didn't just change the direction of my life. It redefined it. And though I couldn't see it then, the man I believed in was not the man who would save me, but the man who would one day hold the key to my cage. The beginning of our journey together felt like planting seeds in fertile soil. He had the vision, the hunger, and I had the energy, the resources, and the will to make it happen. It was almost intoxicating, watching his ideas spring to life, brick by brick, step by step. Where he faltered, I filled in the gaps. Where he doubted, I reassured. I became both the architect and the gardener, nurturing his fragile ambitions into something tangible. At first, it was small things. I helped him polish his words for important meetings, edited his proposals, connected him with people I trusted. He used to laugh and call me his secret weapon, and I wore that title with pride. It felt like we were a team, two people moving in perfect rhythm toward a shared destiny. I thought every ounce of effort I gave was another building block in the foundation of our love. But soon, small sacrifices turned into bigger ones. When his projects demanded more time, I pushed my own aside. When his dreams required money, I opened my savings account without hesitation. I told myself it was temporary, that once he found his footing, we'd stand on equal ground again. But the truth was, I was already kneeling so he could climb higher. I remember one night vividly. We were sitting at the kitchen table, papers spread everywhere, his face glowing with excitement as he explained a new idea. I watched him, mesmerized, and felt a surge of pride. Here was a man who could barely dream out loud when I first met him, now brimming with plans and confidence. And in that moment, I thought, this is worth everything. Every sleepless night, every dollar, every ounce of me, it's worth it. But looking back, I see how the balance tilted. My role shifted quietly from partner to provider, from equal to enabler. He leaned on me so much that soon he couldn't, or maybe wouldn't, stand on his own. And I, blinded by love and duty, convinced myself that carrying him was my purpose. Friends began to notice. One by one, they asked why I seemed so tired, why I was always canceling plans, why every conversation led back to him. I brushed it off, laughing that it was just a busy season, that things would settle soon. But deep down, I knew. I was slowly being consumed, swallowed whole by the future I was building for him. The hardest part was that he thanked me, at first. He would look at me with those grateful eyes, call me his anchor, his compass, his everything. And those words fueled me like oxygen, pushing me to keep giving, keep sacrificing. But as time went on, the gratitude faded. It wasn't thank you anymore. It was, of course. Of course I would stay late. Of course I would cover the bills. Of course I would rearrange my life so his could move forward. What I thought were seeds of love and partnership were actually seeds of dependency. And every time I watered them, I unknowingly fed the roots of something that would one day wrap around me like vines, binding me tighter than any lock ever could. If only I had stopped then. If only I had asked myself, what am I planting, and what will it grow into? But I didn't. I just kept digging, kept sowing, kept sacrificing, because I believed with everything in me that if I built his future strong enough, mine would be safe inside it. I didn't know then that I wasn't planting a garden. I was planting the walls of my prison. The climb felt exhilarating at first. We were side by side, chasing something bigger than ourselves. Each small success was like a rung on a ladder, and with every step upward, I convinced myself that all the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the endless patience, they were paying off. I wasn't just helping him, I was helping us. Or so I thought. He started landing opportunities that once seemed impossible. His voice carried more weight in meetings. His ideas, polished and presented with my guidance, began to gain traction. People listened when he spoke, nodded when he entered the room. And every time they applauded him, I felt my heart swell with pride. I told myself, this is our victory. This is what we built together. I became his shadow, working silently in the background. If he needed research, I stayed up all night. If he needed introductions, I leveraged my contacts. If he needed reassurance before stepping on stage, I whispered the words that steadied his nerves. And each time he shined, I believed it was proof that love was real, that partnerships could conquer the world. The world saw him as ambitious, charismatic, unstoppable. But behind the curtain, it was my handwriting on his notes, my strategy in his speeches, my resilience in his steps. I didn't mind not being seen. I told myself love wasn't about recognition. Love was about giving, even if no one noticed. But then, the giving became expected. The first time he introduced me at an event, he called me his rock, his inspiration. People clapped, and I felt a warm rush of validation. But over time, those words vanished. My name disappeared from his lips. I was no longer inspiration. I was simply there, in the background, invisible but essential. At home, the victories didn't feel shared anymore. He would walk through the door, beaming about the praise he received, the deals he closed, the recognition he gained, and I would smile, clap, and pour us drinks. I celebrated him, even as my own dreams gathered dust in the corner. One night, he looked at me and said, almost casually, "You make me better." His tone wasn't tender. It was possessive, almost as if my worth existed only through him. I laughed at the time, brushed it off as him being tired. But inside, I felt a tremor, a tiny crack forming in the foundation I thought we shared. My friends' voices grew louder in my mind. They had warned me. Be careful. Don't lose yourself. But I told myself it was just jealousy, that they couldn't understand what it meant to build something side by side with the person you loved. And yet, as the climb continued, I noticed something troubling. The higher he rose, the more distant he became. He was no longer looking back at me, reaching for my hand to pull me up with him. No. He was gazing upward, at heights he wanted to reach alone. I wasn't his partner anymore. I was his scaffolding. Useful. Temporary. Replaceable. Still, I didn't stop. I couldn't. I had invested too much. Every part of me whispered that if I just kept giving, if I just kept believing, then one day he would turn around and say, "We did it together." But he never did. And by the time I realized that the climb wasn't ours, it was his. The walls of my prison were already too high to see beyond. At first, the cracks were barely noticeable, thin lines running through the picture-perfect life I thought I was building. If I had looked closer, if I had listened to my gut, I might have recognized them for what they were. But love has a way of blinding you, convincing you that shadows are just tricks of the light. It began with little comments, subtle corrections. He would ask where I was going, not in a curious tone, but with a sharpness that suggested I owed him an answer. If I said I wanted to spend time with friends, he'd sigh and say, "Again? Don't you think you've seen them enough?" I told myself he just wanted to be with me, that it was sweet in its own way. But the sweetness curdled quickly. He started monitoring my choices, what I wore, what I said, even how I spent money. At first, it was framed as concern. "That outfit doesn't really suit you. Are you sure you need to buy that? We should save." They sounded harmless, like suggestions. But over time, those suggestions hardened into rules, spoken with the kind of finality that left no room for argument. The phone calls were another clue. He'd call me during the day, asking where I was, who I was with. If I didn't answer immediately, the questions piled up. "Why didn't you pick up? What were you doing? Who else was there?" I laughed it off to friends, calling him protective. But deep down, I felt the leash tightening. And then came the schedule. My time no longer felt like mine. He wanted to know every detail of my day, when I was working, when I was resting, when I was going out. If I forgot to mention something, even something small, he would turn cold. His silence was heavy, punishing, like walls pressing in on me. The strangest part? I adapted. Instead of resisting, I found myself adjusting to keep him calm. I edited my words before speaking, double-checked my plans before sharing, even changed how I dressed to avoid his disapproving stare. It wasn't that he asked me to change outright. It was that I feared the consequences if I didn't. Looking back, those cracks were glaring, but at the time, I smoothed over them with excuses. "He's just stressed. He wants the best for me. He loves me too much to let go." I repeated those phrases until they became a shield against the truth. My friends noticed before I did. "You don't laugh the same way anymore," one of them whispered one evening. I brushed it off, told her I was just tired. But later that night, when I looked in the mirror, I didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her eyes looked cautious, trapped, as if she was waiting for permission to breathe. The subtle cracks weren't just cracks, they were warnings. Signs that the foundation of what we were building wasn't love at all. It was control, creeping in slowly, disguising itself as care. And by the time I realized it, the cracks had already begun to spread, threatening to shatter everything I thought was solid. But instead of walking away, I chose to patch them, to hold everything together with my bare hands. Because I told myself that love was worth fighting for, even when it was already slipping through my fingers. The walls didn't appear overnight. They crept in slowly, built from the same bricks I had once laid with love. At first, it was just a sense of unease, like a draft slipping through a window I couldn't close. But soon, it became undeniable. The freedom I once had was shrinking, room by room, until the house I thought we were building together began to feel like a cage. His career was soaring. Invitations, opportunities, recognition, everything we had worked for was now within his grasp. And while the world applauded him, I felt the applause fading from my own life. He didn't need me to encourage him anymore. He needed me to obey. The change was subtle at first. If I wanted to go out with friends, he would insist I stay home. "Why waste time with them?" he'd say, "when we could be focusing on the future?" The future, always dangled like a promise, always used as a weapon. If I argued, his face hardened, and the conversation ended with silence so cold it froze me into submission. He began to control more than my time. The way I dressed was no longer mine to decide. If my outfit drew attention, he'd sneer, "Do you want everyone looking at you?" If I wore something plain, he'd ask why I wasn't making more of an effort for him. No choice was right unless it aligned with his unspoken rules. Even my voice felt like it no longer belonged to me. At gatherings, if I spoke too much, he'd gently place a hand on my knee, a silent command to quiet down. If I offered an opinion he disagreed with, he'd correct me in front of others, turning my words into mistakes. Slowly, I learned to measure every syllable, to shrink into a version of myself that caused the least disruption. The surveillance grew sharper. He wanted to know where I was at all times, who I spoke to, what I said. He checked my phone, questioned every message, every call. Privacy wasn't a boundary anymore. It was an offense. I stopped reaching out to people, not because I didn't miss them, but because the consequences of being found out were heavier than the comfort their voices could bring. And yet, the outside world saw only perfection. They saw the charming man, the polished couple, the future that sparkled like gold. When he draped an arm around me in public, people thought it was affection. They didn't see the grip tighten when I smiled too warmly at someone else. I told myself I was overreacting, that all couples go through phases, that love sometimes feels heavy. I convinced myself that his control was really protection, that his rules were a way of showing care. But the truth I buried deep inside was much darker. I wasn't being loved. I was being managed. And the most terrifying part? I barely fought back. With every restriction, every command, every rule, I adjusted. I convinced myself this was normal, that I was strong enough to endure it, that enduring it was proof of my love. I didn't see then that every time I adjusted, the walls grew tighter. The woman I once was, independent, laughing, free, was vanishing, and in her place stood someone smaller, quieter, trapped. Someone who looked around at the walls closing in and whispered the most dangerous lie of all. "This is what love is supposed to feel like." He said it was for my safety, that the world was full of people who didn't understand me the way he did, people who would twist my words, betray my trust, or drag me down from the heights we had worked so hard to reach. I wanted to believe him. After all, he spoke with such certainty, such conviction, as if he knew truths I couldn't see. But what he called protection was really isolation, dressed up to look like love. It started with small suggestions. "Why don't you skip that dinner? You don't really need them. Your family doesn't get us. They'll only fill your head with doubts." At first, I resisted. I argued that friendships and family ties mattered, that I needed balance. But he always had an answer, always a way to make me feel guilty for even wanting those connections. I thought we were building a future together. Why do you need anyone else? And so, little by little, I stopped reaching out. Friends texted, and I delayed my replies. Invitations came, and I politely declined. My parents asked if I was okay, and I assured them I was just busy. The more I distanced myself, the easier it became to justify the distance. After all, if the people who loved me truly supported me, wouldn't they understand the sacrifices I was making? That's what he told me. And I clung to his words, even as they tightened like chains around my heart. Home became the center of my world, and he was the center of my home. He insisted it was safer that way. Out there, people lie. Out there, people hurt you. In here, with me, you'll always be protected. He said it often enough that I began to believe him. The world outside grew dim and distant, like a place I once knew, but no longer belonged to. There were moments I felt the loss acutely. Birthdays I missed. Weddings I wasn't invited to anymore. Phone calls from friends that grew less frequent until they stopped altogether. I told myself it didn't matter. I had him, and that was enough. But late at night, when the silence pressed in, I felt the ache of loneliness settle deep into my bones. The cruel irony was that he made me believe the cage was my choice. He never locked the doors himself. He convinced me to close them. Every time I thought about reaching out, I heard his voice in my head. Why risk it? You're safer here. And so I stayed. Not because I wanted to, but because I had forgotten how to leave. To the outside world, nothing seemed wrong. We looked like a perfect couple, united and inseparable. But behind the closed doors of our home, I was disappearing. My laughter, once loud and unrestrained, grew quieter until it was nearly gone. My opinions, once shared freely, were swallowed before they could leave my lips. Isolation has a way of making you doubt yourself. Without friends to confide in, without family to remind you of who you are, you start to believe the story you've been fed, and his story was simple. I was fragile, the world was cruel, and only he could keep me safe. The saddest part? For a long time, I believed him. There came a day when I realized the scales had tipped completely, and not in my favor. What started as small sacrifices, things I thought were temporary, had grown into a reality where every ounce of power belonged to him. The balance we once had, or that I believed we had, was gone. What remained was dependence, his control, and my silence. The signs were everywhere. He had control of the finances. At first, it was innocent enough. He offered to manage our savings so we could stay on track. I thought it was responsible, even admirable. But soon, I had to ask him before making the smallest purchase. My debit card was quietly replaced with one linked to his account. If I spent money without asking, he'd frown, then remind me how hard he was working for us. He spoke as though every dollar was his alone, and I was a careless child who needed supervision. The house, once ours, became his kingdom. He chose the furniture, the decor, even the color of the curtains. My suggestions were brushed aside with a laugh. That doesn't really fit my vision. His vision, that word stung. Somewhere along the way, the dream had stopped being ours and became solely his, while mine dissolved into silence. I noticed it most in conversations. He spoke, I listened. He decided, I agreed. If I dared to disagree, his eyes hardened, and the room filled with an unspoken tension that left me breathless. Sometimes he didn't even need to raise his voice. His silence was worse, a wall of disapproval that made me crumble faster than any shouting ever could. I became voiceless in my own life. When people asked about my opinions, I deferred to his. When someone complimented me, I redirected the praise to him. It wasn't just that he overshadowed me, it was that I had been taught, little by little, that my light was unwelcome. He held the keys, too, literally and figuratively. The car was under his name, the house deeds, the bank accounts, the passwords. Every escape route I once had was tied back to him. If I wanted to leave, where would I go? With what money? With what support system, after being cut off from everyone I loved? He had thought of everything, and I had unknowingly handed him the tools. One evening, I tried to bring it up gently, to suggest that maybe we could share more of the decisions, the responsibilities. He looked at me for a long time before saying, "Do you really think you'd survive without me?" The words sliced through me, sharp and cold. And the worst part was that for a moment, I believed him. That's how power works when it shifts so quietly. It doesn't happen with a sudden storm. It happens like a slow erosion. One day, you look around, and you don't even recognize the landscape of your life. The freedom you once took for granted is gone, replaced by invisible chains that feel heavier than steel. I had built his future with my bare hands, and in return, I had been stripped of mine. I wish I could tell you that I fought back right away, that I stormed out the door the moment I realized what he had taken from me. But the truth is, I didn't. Fear has a way of sinking into your bones, whispering that resistance is useless, that silence is safer. And so my cries for help were not loud. They were quiet, hidden, desperate. At first, it was small rebellions. I would sneak moments to myself, writing in a notebook I hid in the back of a drawer. Words became my secret companions, the only place I could speak freely. I poured my thoughts onto those pages, letters I never dared send, fragments of the person I used to be. Every sentence was a reminder that I still existed, even if only in ink. Sometimes, when he wasn't looking, I made short calls to old friends. I kept my voice low, my stories vague. I couldn't tell them the whole truth. I was terrified he might overhear. Instead, I'd ask how they were, listen to their lives moving forward without me. I clung to those brief conversations like oxygen, even as they left me gasping when the call ended. Once, I even wrote a letter to my parents. I didn't explain everything, I couldn't. But I tried to hint that I wasn't okay. I folded it carefully, slipped it into an envelope, and stared at it for days. But in the end, I never mailed it. I was too afraid of what might happen if he found out. The silence ate at me. Every time I tried to reach outward, the weight of his presence pulled me back in. He didn't need to raise his hand or shout. The possibility of his anger was enough to keep me in line. And so my cries for help remained silent, trapped within walls that muffled every sound. But even in that silence, there were sparks. Tiny flickers of rebellion that reminded me I hadn't disappeared completely. I began to memorize things, numbers, addresses, small details I thought might one day matter if I needed to leave. I hid cash, just a few bills at a time, tucked away in places I prayed he would never look. I told myself it was foolish, but the act of hiding gave me a fragile sense of control. At night, when he slept, I'd stare at the ceiling and imagine a different life. A life where my laughter was free, where my words mattered, where my steps weren't monitored. Those dreams were both a comfort and a torment. Comfort, because they reminded me freedom existed. Torment, because they felt so far out of reach. And yet, even in the darkest moments, a part of me refused to die. That silent cry, though muffled, was still a cry. It meant I hadn't fully surrendered. It meant that somewhere, buried deep beneath the fear, there was still a woman who believed she deserved to be heard. I didn't know it then, but those hidden rebellions, the scribbled words, The unsent letters, the secret savings, were the first cracks in the walls of my prison. There's always a moment when everything you've ignored, everything you've patched over, comes crashing down at once. For me, it was a night I will never forget. The night when love's mask slipped, and I saw the prison I was living in for what it really was. The evening started like any other. He came home late, his mood already stormy. I could feel the tension before he even walked through the door, the slam of his shoes against the floor, the sharpness in his voice when he called my name. I hurried to greet him, hoping to soften the edge in his tone. But nothing worked. Every word I spoke seemed to irritate him more. Every movement I made felt like a mistake. We sat down to dinner, but the silence was suffocating. I could hear the scrape of his fork against the plate, steady and aggressive. I tried to fill the silence, to ease the atmosphere, but my attempt at conversation only triggered his anger. His voice rose, sharp and cruel, accusing me of things I hadn't done, spending too much, being ungrateful, not supporting him enough. It wasn't the first time he'd spoken to me that way. But that night, something changed. He leaned in closer, his face twisted with rage, and his words weren't just angry, they were venomous. They cut deeper than ever before, stripping me of any illusion I had left about what we were. And when I tried to defend myself, his hand slammed against the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the room. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I truly believed he might hurt me. And maybe that's when it hit me. He already had. Not with fists, not with bruises, but with years of control, years of silence, years of convincing me that my life belonged to him. In that instant, the walls around me felt more real than ever. The house wasn't a home. It was a prison. The love I had clung to wasn't love at all. It was a chain, and I was no longer a partner. I was a captive. When the storm of his anger passed, he acted as if nothing had happened. He leaned back in his chair, calm again, and muttered something about stress. But I couldn't hear him anymore. My ears rang with the realization that I wasn't safe. Not physically, not emotionally, not in any way that mattered. That night, when he finally went to bed, I sat in the dark, staring at the shadows on the wall. My hands trembled, my chest ached, but my mind was sharper than it had been in months. The truth was undeniable. If I stayed, I would disappear completely. The breaking point wasn't just his anger, it was my clarity. For the first time, I saw the full picture. The control, the isolation, the fear. It wasn't a rough patch. It wasn't love gone sour. It was captivity. And as terrifying as it was, that realization planted something new inside me, a desperate, fragile determination. I didn't know how or when, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I couldn't live in that prison forever. Something had to change. When you're trapped, memory becomes both your enemy and your lifeline. I found myself drifting back to the person I used to be, as if reminding myself of her could keep me from disappearing completely. I remembered the mornings when I woke up without fear, stretching lazily in bed, the sun painting stripes of gold across my room. I used to hum while making coffee, scroll through my phone to check on friends, and step outside knowing my day was mine to shape. I remembered the sound of laughter, my laughter, loud, unguarded, spilling out of me like music. I remembered walking into rooms with confidence, speaking my mind without hesitation, knowing my words carried weight. I remembered the freedom of making choices. What to wear, where to go, who to meet, without second guessing or worrying about someone else's disapproval. I remembered being loved not for what I could give, but for who I was. And then I would look around at the life I was in now. The heavy silence of the house, the way my chest tightened every time I heard his footsteps, the way my own reflection startled me. A woman with eyes dulled by caution, shoulders bowed from carrying too much. The contrast was unbearable. I had gone from vibrant to muted, from free to caged, and yet remembering the old me gave me something precious. Proof that she had existed. Proof that I hadn't always been this small, this silent, this broken. One evening, I stumbled across an old photo. It was tucked away in a drawer, almost forgotten. In it, I was standing with friends, my arms thrown around their shoulders, my smile wide and genuine. My eyes were alive. I stared at that photo for a long time, tracing the edges of the woman I used to be, and I whispered, "I miss you." That memory became a secret ember in my chest, small but burning, because if I had once been that woman, maybe I could be her again. Maybe she wasn't gone forever, just buried beneath the weight of his control. But memories cut both ways. Alongside the warmth came the ache of loss. I mourned the years I couldn't get back, the friendships that had withered, the family dinners I had missed. I thought of the paths I never walked because I was too busy clearing his. The regret was sharp, almost unbearable. And yet, regret has a way of sharpening resolve. The more I remembered, the more I realized I didn't just want freedom. I needed it. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of who I used to be. I had to fight to bring her back, no matter how impossible it seemed. Memory reminded me that I had once been whole, and it whispered the truth I had nearly forgotten. I was still worth saving. It began quietly, so quietly I almost didn't recognize it as resistance. A single thought, a whisper that grew louder each day. I deserved to be free. For months, I had drowned in his voice, his rules, his demands, until my own voice felt like a distant echo. But once that whisper returned, it refused to leave. The first spark came in a moment of exhaustion. He had left for a meeting, and I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the list of tasks he expected me to complete before his return. The list felt endless, each item a reminder of my servitude. I picked up the pen to begin checking things off, but instead of starting, I froze. My hand trembled, and in that stillness, the thought surfaced. What about me? That was it. Just 4 words. But they struck like lightning, illuminating the darkness I'd been living in. What about me? What about my dreams, my voice, my life? The questions spun in my mind, and with them came a surge of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Anger. Not the kind that destroyed, but the kind that ignited. I started small. When he asked me a question, instead of answering immediately, I paused. That pause was mine. It was choice, control, space. When he criticized my cooking, I bit back the apology that rose automatically to my lips. I didn't argue, but I didn't surrender either. It was subtle, almost invisible to him, but inside, I felt a shift. I began reclaiming moments for myself. A longer shower, where I let the water wash over me like a promise of renewal. A late-night journal entry, written in a code only I could understand, where my words flowed free again. Even the simple act of breathing deeply, silently reminding myself that my body, my breath, was still mine. Of course, fear lingered. Every spark of defiance carried the risk of being snuffed out. If he noticed, if he grew suspicious, I could pay dearly for it. But fear and hope began to wrestle inside me, and for the first time, hope was winning. The real turning point came one evening when he tried to dismiss me in front of others. His words were sharp, meant to belittle me, but instead of shrinking, I held his gaze. I didn't say much, just a quiet, steady look that refused to break. And in that silence, I felt a flicker of power return to me. He looked away first. That night, as I lay awake, my mind replayed that moment over and over. It was small, almost insignificant, but to me, it was everything. It was proof that I still had a choice, that his grip wasn't absolute. And with that realization, the whisper grew louder. I deserve to be free. I deserve to live. It was no longer just a thought. It was a vow. The first spark of resistance had caught fire, and though it burned quietly, it was only a matter of time before it grew into something unstoppable. Once the whisper became a vow, my mind shifted into survival mode. Every day turned into a test of patience and secrecy as I began to plan my escape. It wasn't just about leaving, it was about leaving without him noticing until it was too late. I started by memorizing details, the numbers on our bank statements, the passcodes he used carelessly in front of me, the names of contacts who might still remember me. I didn't dare write them down. Paper could be found, ink could betray me. So I rehearsed them silently, over and over, until they were carved into my memory like scars. Then I began saving. Small amounts, nothing that would catch his attention. A few bills hidden in the lining of a coat, coins slipped into the pocket of an old bag he never touched. Each hidden dollar felt like a stolen piece of freedom, and though the stash was pitifully small, it represented hope. I tested the boundaries of my cage. When he stepped out, I tried doors, windows, checking locks he thought I never questioned. I studied the rhythms of his schedule. When he left, how long he was gone, the moments when his guard dropped. Every pattern was a map, and I traced it until I knew the terrain better than he did. But planning wasn't just about logistics. It was about rebuilding courage, piece by piece. Fear had kept me silent for so long that even imagining leaving sent shivers down my spine. What if he caught me? What if I failed? What if the outside world, the one he told me was so dangerous, really didn't want me anymore? These questions haunted me, but I pushed through them with a new mantra. Better to risk failing in freedom than to succeed in captivity. I thought about the people I'd lost, friends whose numbers I hadn't dialed in years, family I'd only seen in fading photos. Would they take me back? Would they understand? I didn't know, but I clung to the possibility. Because even if no one welcomed me, I knew I couldn't keep living in a life where I wasn't even allowed to welcome myself. At night, as he slept beside me, I would stare at the ceiling and rehearse my escape in my mind. I imagined the path out the door, the weight of the hidden cash in my hand, the sound of my footsteps carrying me further away. Sometimes I even pictured what it would feel like to breathe without fear again, to laugh without permission. These fantasies weren't just dreams, they were rehearsals. And slowly, the fear began to shift into resolve. Each step of planning made me stronger, more certain. Each hidden detail, each secret act, was proof that he hadn't taken everything from me. I was no longer just his shadow. I was a shadow, learning how to move without being seen, preparing for the moment when I could finally step back into the light. I didn't know when the chance would come. But when it did, I would be ready. The night I broke free is etched into me like a scar. Sharp, vivid, unforgettable. It wasn't dramatic in the way movies make escapes seem. There were no car chases, no screaming confrontations. It was quieter than that. But the silence of it made my heart pound even louder. It began like any other evening. He was restless, pacing, muttering about work, about people who didn't respect him enough. I kept my head low, nodding when expected, offering small reassurances that bounced off him like pebbles against steel. Eventually, He stormed into the bedroom and slammed the door shut. The sound echoed through the house, but instead of fear, something else filled me. Opportunity. I don't know what made that night different. Maybe it was the way my chest had been tight for weeks, the way my silent stash of hidden cash had finally grown to something tangible. Or maybe it was just the clarity of knowing that if I didn't act now, I might never act at all. Whatever it was, I felt the shift. My body trembled, but my mind was steady. I moved carefully, quietly. The small envelope of money I'd hidden inside an old shoe was already waiting. I slipped it into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the edges as if to remind myself it was real. I grabbed the coat that hung by the door. Plain, unremarkable, easy to blend in. Every sound felt magnified. The creak of the floorboards, the whisper of fabric, the faint hum of the refrigerator. My heart was so loud, I was terrified he would hear it, even behind the closed door. I paused more than once, straining my ears for any sign of movement. Nothing. Only silence. The keys were the riskiest part. He kept them by the door, jangling reminders of the freedom I didn't have. My hand shook as I reached for them, praying they wouldn't clatter. When I finally curled them into my fist, I felt a surge of power I hadn't felt in years. I slipped out the front door, every nerve in my body on fire. The night air hit me like a wave, cold and sharp, filling my lungs with something I hadn't tasted in too long. Freedom. My legs felt weak, but they carried me down the steps, across the yard, and onto the street. Each step was terrifying, exhilarating, unreal. I didn't run at first. Running felt too loud, too reckless. I walked quickly, my eyes darting to every shadow, every passing car. It wasn't until I turned the corner and his house was out of sight that I let myself break into a sprint. My lungs burned, my chest heaved, but I didn't care. For the first time in years, the only voice I heard was my own, screaming inside me. Go. Don't look back. I didn't know where I was heading. I had no grand plan beyond leaving, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was never going back. That night, under the pale glow of the streetlights, I wasn't his prisoner anymore. I was free, fragile, trembling, uncertain, but free. And in that moment, that was enough. The morning after felt unreal. I woke not to the sound of his voice, not to the heaviness of his footsteps, but to silence. Gentle, forgiving silence. The kind that doesn't demand, doesn't punish, doesn't control. For the first time in so long, the air felt light. My lungs expanded fully, my chest unburdened, as though every breath was teaching me how to live again. The world outside looked the same. Cars humming along the street, people hurrying to work, a child laughing as they tugged on their parent's hand. But to me, it was transformed. Every ordinary sight shimmered with a brilliance I hadn't noticed before. The taste of freedom sharpened my senses. Even the morning sun, filtering softly through a cafe window where I sat, seemed like a miracle. Of course, it wasn't easy. My body was free, but my mind was still tangled in years of chains. Guilt clung to me. Guilt for leaving, for betraying the man I had once promised to love. Fear lingered too, whispering that he might find me, that I hadn't escaped as fully as I thought. Yet underneath all that, something stronger pulsed. Relief. The kind of relief that comes only when survival has been wrestled back from the edge. Day by day, I began to rebuild. Slowly, carefully. I made calls, first to family, then to friends, voices I hadn't heard in years. Some answered with tears, others with disbelief, but all with a kind of warmth I had forgotten I deserved. Their words didn't erase the years I'd lost, but they stitched small pieces of me back together. I learned to laugh again, though at first it felt foreign on my tongue. I learned to choose without asking permission. What to wear, what to eat, where to go. Simple choices, but each one was an act of defiance against the prison I had left behind. And then, one evening, as I stood at the window of a tiny apartment I could finally call mine, I whispered something to myself. I am still here. The words were soft, but they carried a power that shook me. After everything, after the darkness and the silence and the fear, I was still here. I don't pretend the scars are gone. They linger, woven into me like threads I can't cut loose. But scars are proof of survival, not defeat. They remind me of the cage I once lived in, and of the strength it took to break free. So now, I tell my story, not because it's easy, but because it matters. Because somewhere, someone might be listening, trapped in their own quiet prison, convinced they are alone. To them, I want to say, you are not. There is a way out, even if it begins with the smallest whisper. And to you, listening now, thank you. Thank you for walking this path with me, for holding this story in your hands. As I let the images blur, as I soften my voice into a whisper, I want you to feel the same lightness I finally found. Breathe it in. Let it linger. Carry it with you. Because this isn't just the end of my story, it's the beginning of another. One built not on chains, but on choice. Not on control, but on freedom. Thank you for reading the whole story. Hope you will support my next products.